On May 14, 1852, every newspaper in Charleston ran the same headline. A young man, barely 23, had sold for a price that broke every record ever set at the Charleston Exchange House. They called him the most beautiful male slave ever put on the marble auction block. But what the papers didn't print, what the auctioneers never said aloud, was the secret that made his sale not only remarkable, but impossible. 7 witnesses would later swear under oath that the man standing on that platform could not have existed. Not because of how he looked, but because of who he was. The most powerful families in Charleston fought bitterly to own him. One of them succeeded. 3 months later, that family no longer existed. The records of his sale were sealed by the South Carolina legislature in 1853 and have never been opened since. And until now, no one has asked the question that should have been obvious from the beginning. Why would anyone pay a fortune for a slave who was already legally free? Before we return to the Charleston Exchange House and the young man who should never have stood on its stage, I need to ask you something. If you're listening from South Carolina, Georgia, or anywhere along the old coastal slave routes, leave a comment telling me your state. Because what happened in Charleston in 1852 may have sent ripples into your own family's history. And if you want more stories like this, stories they tried to bury, hit that subscribe button right now. The answer to the question begins not in Charleston at all, but miles upriver at a plantation that appears on no modern map. Riverbend Parish Plantation lay 40 miles up the Ashley River, a sprawling rice and indigo estate that had belonged to the Devereaux family since 1791. By 1852, Riverbend Parish was one of the wealthiest operations in South Carolina, producing thousands of barrels of rice and employing, if that word could be used, more than 200 enslaved people. The main house was a towering example of low-country Creole aristocracy, whitewashed brick, iron-laced galleries wrapping around all 3 floors. Live oaks lining the river road with their branches so heavy with moss that visitors often described the drive as stepping into a tunnel between worlds. The Devereaux family considered themselves distinct, superior even, not only to the planters who came later from the north, but also to most of Charleston's society. They spoke French among themselves, attended Mass in Latin, and maintained marriages within a tightly controlled circle of old French Creole families whose names had appeared in colonial records long before the American Revolution. Augustin Devereaux, the master of Riverbend Parish in 1852, was 56. A widower for 8 years, a man known for meticulous record-keeping and unassailable reputation. His ledgers were legendary, every entry written in perfect script, double-checked, cross-referenced, bound in leather that lasted generations. He attended the same pew at St. Mary of the Annunciation Catholic Church his father had purchased in 1802. He invested in the right rice mills, served on the right boards, played cards in the right salons, and married his 3 daughters into families whose names held weight from Savannah to New Orleans. He was a pillar of Creole society, the sort of man whose handshake carried the same force as a signed contract. That was how people described him. But there were always some who whispered he was a man who valued appearances more than truth.
His younger brother, Christopher, was the opposite. Charming, talented, impractical. A dreamer who learned piano instead of plantation management, poetry instead of profit. While Augustine learned how to flood a rice field at precisely the right tide, Christopher learned how to recite verses in Parisian cafes. When their father died in 1821, he left the entire estate to Augustine. Christopher received only an allowance, small, conditional, and with one brutal stipulation: he must never interfere with the family business. Within 6 months, Christopher was gone, boarding a ship to France with money he hadn't earned and a future he hadn't thought through. For 6 years, letters arrived from Paris. Elegant, breathless accounts of salons, operas, smoky cafes where philosophers debated until sunrise. Every so often, a debt followed the letter. Augustine paid them, and though he resented it, he preferred distance to conflict. Then, in 1827, the unexpected happened. Christopher married. The letter announcing the marriage contained a small daguerreotype that must have cost him dearly. The woman, Celeste Monroe, was young, no more than 20, delicate, serene, with eyes that seemed to look directly through the camera. Her hair was styled in the fashion of Paris, and her dress, though simple, carried unmistakable elegance. What Christopher did not mention, but what the photograph made clear to anyone who looked closely, was Celeste's ancestry. She bore features that hinted unmistakably at African lineage, subtle but present. In Paris, it meant nothing. In Charleston, it would have been catastrophic. Augustine recognized it instantly, and his response came swiftly. Christopher was no longer welcome at Riverbend Parish. His allowance would continue, but only if he stayed away and never contacted the family again. The marriage was not recognized. Any children would be ignored. In the eyes of the Devereux family, Christopher had died in Paris in 1827. 4 months later, Christopher responded with equal calm. "I understand. I'm sorry for the disappointment. My son was born last week. His name is John Baptiste. He will never know he had an uncle in South Carolina." For 24 years, Christopher kept that promise. No letters except for confirmation of life from a Paris bank. Augustine married, raised 3 daughters, and buried his wife after a fever swept through Charleston in 1844. He never once spoke his brother's name. Then, in March of 1852, everything changed. A letter arrived from a hotel in New York City. The handwriting was Christopher's, but weak, trembling, as if the pen had been too heavy to hold. Consumption, diagnosed 6 months earlier, now advanced. The doctors offered him 3 months at most. He had one request, one final plea to the brother who had supported him financially but banished him personally. "My son, John Baptiste, is 23, educated at the Sorbonne, speaks 4 languages, has never done manual labor. His mother is gone. I have exhausted everything on treatment. When I die, he will have nothing. I am asking you, take him in, not as family, I know that is impossible, but as something, a secretary perhaps." Augustine read the letter 3 times. His first instinct was refusal. The boy's ancestry made him a liability, a scandal. But Augustine was also a practical man. Practicality has its own morality. And as he folded the letter, an idea, a profitable, terrible idea, began to form. He wrote back, "John Baptiste should come to Riverbend Parish." And that was the moment the impossible story began.
John Baptiste Devereux arrived at Riverbend Parish Plantation on April 3, 1852, stepping off a small steamboat that had carried him 40 miles upriver from Charleston. The afternoon was unseasonably hot for early April, the kind of heat that clung to the skin even in the shade. Augustin Devereux stood waiting on the landing alongside his overseer, Gaines Rutherford, and 3 trusted house servants. It was meant to be an ordinary reception, quiet, discreet, unremarkable. What stepped off the boat made everyone present go utterly silent. John Baptiste was, without exaggeration, one of the most striking young men any of them had ever seen. Well over 6 feet tall, slender but not fragile, carrying himself with an elegance that belonged more to Parisian salons than the Carolina Low Country. His hair was black, wavy, pushed back in a style that marked him instantly as foreign. His eyes, an uncanny amber gold, caught the light like polished glass. His features were finely sculpted, symmetrical, almost aristocratic, the sort of face portrait artists would have fought to paint. His skin was pale, smooth, the shade of porcelain warmed by Mediterranean sun. Nothing about him suggested African ancestry. If anything, he looked more European than Augustin himself. He carried a single leather trunk, expensive once, now worn, and he wore a traveling coat that had been expertly tailored years earlier and carefully repaired since. He looked like a young man trying, with diminishing success, to maintain the appearance of a life that had already slipped away. When he reached the foot of the gangplank, he set down the trunk and looked directly at Augustin. For a moment, neither man moved. Augustin saw his brother's face, Christopher's younger, hopeful version, reflected in this stranger. Jean-Baptiste saw the uncle whose rejection had shaped the course of his father's entire life. Then Jean-Baptiste extended his hand. "Monsieur Devereaux, I am Jean-Baptiste. Thank you for receiving me. I know this must be difficult for you. It is difficult for me as well." His tone was polite, careful, but without submission. A man educated to stand as an equal with anyone. Augustin didn't take his hand. Instead, he studied him as one might study a rare object, measuring, calculating, searching for flaws. He found none. He turned abruptly. "Follow me." Gaines Rutherford stepped forward and lifted the trunk without a word. The three house servants, all light-skinned Creole domestics, accustomed to observing everything and commenting on nothing, watched intently as Jean-Baptiste followed Augustin up the path toward the main house. But they did not go inside. Instead, Augustin led him past the great iron-laced galleries, around the manicured gardens, and toward a row of small cabins behind the house, buildings reserved for household slaves who were trusted enough to serve near the family, but never trusted enough to sleep under the same roof. Augustin opened the door of one such cabin. It contained one bed, one table, one chair, a wash basin, a small fireplace, and nothing else. "This will be your quarters," Augustin said in French. "Food and water will be brought. We will discuss your role in the morning. You will not leave this cabin tonight. You will not speak to anyone. Do you understand?" "I understand," he said quietly. "May I ask?" "No." Augustin left, taking Gaines with him. The door closed, the key turned. Jean-Baptiste was alone. That evening, Marie-Claire Benoit, one of the house servants, brought him food: rice, beans, a piece of chicken, bread. She kept her eyes lowered, as if afraid to look at him too directly. When he thanked her in French, she froze mid-motion, startled. "You speak French?" she whispered. "Yes," he said. "Do you know who I am?" "You're his nephew," she said carefully. "People talk." Jean-Baptiste hesitated. "Does he know about my mother?" Marie-Claire's eyes lifted just enough to meet his. "He knows," she said softly, "and that means you must be careful. Mr. Devereaux is not cruel, but he is practical, and practical men, sometimes they do terrible things if it makes sense on paper."
She left before he could respond. He ate because hunger overcame pride. Then he opened his trunk. Inside were the pieces of his life. His clothing, patched with quiet dignity, books, including Montaigne's essays and a French Bible, a packet of his father's letters, and his most important possession, a leather portfolio containing all his documents. His Parisian birth certificate, listing him as freeborn to Christopher Devereaux and Celeste Monroe. His baptismal record from Église Saint-Sulpice. His Sorbonne certificates, letters of recommendation in academic French. Every paper proving he was not someone who could legally be owned. He spread the papers on the table, feeling again the words his father had once told him. "Your papers are your soul. Guard them like your life depends on them, because it very well might." For a long time, he stared at them. Then, acting on instinct, he took a fresh sheet of paper and began listing each document in meticulous detail. The issuing authority, the dates, the signatures, the seals. He wrote quietly, filling pages with an index of his own identity. When finished, he hid this inventory inside the spine of Montaigne, where no one would find it unless they searched for precisely such a thing. He slept lightly that night, fully clothed, listening to the foreign sounds of the Carolina Low Country, cicadas buzzing like distant machinery, frogs croaking, faint singing drifting from the quarters, and underneath it all, the whispering rush of the Ashley River,
like a wide, dark mouth murmuring secrets he wasn't meant to hear. At 8 the next morning, Augustin summoned him to the study. A grand room lined with books he suspected Augustin rarely read, and ledgers he suspected Augustin read obsessively. Augustin sat behind his massive desk. Jean-Baptiste stood before it, the posture of a master addressing property. "You have your papers?" he asked. "Yes, monsieur." "I will examine them, for your protection, of course. There are many forged documents circulating in South Carolina. I want to ensure yours are authentic." Every instinct screamed not to hand them over, but refusing meant eviction, homelessness, danger. He had no money, no allies, no options. Slowly, he took the portfolio and placed it on the desk. Augustin examined every document, occasionally jotting notes in a small notebook. After 20 minutes, he closed the portfolio, put it in his desk drawer, and locked it. "These appear authentic," he said. "I will keep them here for safekeeping." Then he folded his hands. "Now, let us discuss your situation." His tone changed, softer, more controlled, crueler. "You are my brother's son, yes, but your mother was a woman of color. In South Carolina, that makes you a person of color also, regardless of appearance. If I acknowledged you as my nephew, it would create untenable complications for me. My position, my family status, everything depends on reputation. I cannot risk scandal." Jean-Baptiste said nothing. Augustin continued. "However, I am not without charity. I will give you shelter, food, and work. You will serve as my secretary. In exchange, you will allow everyone to believe you are a light-skinned slave I acquired privately." The word hit like a blow. "A slave?" Jean-Baptiste repeated. "Only in appearance," Augustin said smoothly. "A temporary fiction, for your protection. In time, perhaps after certain social matters settle, I may arrange passage for you north or back to France. But for now, this is necessary." "And if I refuse?" Jean-Baptiste asked quietly. "Then I return your papers and give you enough money to reach Charleston. After that, you are alone. And in a city like this, with your appearance and uncertain status, you would be challenged immediately, and likely enslaved by someone far less scrupulous than I." They stared at each other. Both understood the truth. Refusing meant destruction. "I understand," Jean-Baptiste said at last. And Augustin nodded, satisfied. That was the moment Jean-Baptiste ceased to exist as a free man and became something entirely different. For the next 5 weeks, everything unfolded exactly as Augustin Devereaux intended. Jean-Baptiste lived in the small cabin behind the main house, waking before dawn each morning and reporting to a modest office adjacent to Augustin's study. His work was demanding, but suited perfectly to his education, translating letters from French merchants, preparing correspondence for rice brokers, maintaining ledgers that Augustin preferred written in French to discourage prying eyes. Jean-Baptiste never made errors. His handwriting was elegant, precise, flowing across the page in a style that reminded several observers, quietly, of old French nobility. Augustin quickly discovered that his nephew's intelligence was not merely academic. Jean-Baptiste could read contracts with a lawyer's eye and analyze financial arrangements with a sophistication that startled even Augustin. The young man offered opinions on investments, shipping schedules, and European politics, each time with a measured tone that suggested both humility and deep knowledge. Even when his advice proved correct, and it often did, he delivered it with a gentle softness that never overstepped the boundaries Augustin imposed. The enslaved community at Riverbend Parish found him confusing. He looked whiter than many planters' sons, but lived among them. He spoke French like the Creoles in the big house, but carried himself differently, like someone who'd grown up reading books instead of obeying orders. He was educated, refined, and clearly important to Augustine, and yet lived in a servant's cabin. Some distrusted him, unsure what he was. Others pitied him quietly. Some simply observed him with wary curiosity. A few, Marie-Claire Benoit, Thomas Bellamy, and Eunice Barron, extended small acts of kindness, an extra portion of food, a warning whispered when Augustine was irritable, small bits of advice on how to navigate the invisible rules that governed plantation life. Jean-Baptiste accepted these gestures with gratitude and humility, but he kept mostly to himself, spending evenings in his cabin reading Montaigne, writing letters to his father that he never mailed, and thinking about the life he had lost. But Augustine had miscalculated something. He believed he could keep Jean-Baptiste hidden, a private asset. He underestimated what would happen when he brought the young man to Charleston. The trip happened on May 7th. Augustine had several business meetings in the city and decided, almost impulsively, that Jean-Baptiste should accompany him to take notes and translate. The steamboat carried them down the Ashley River into the bustling chaos of Charleston's docks. Ships from the Caribbean, the Northeast, France, and England crowded every pier. The smell of salt, horses, sweat, and river mud filled the air. Dozens of enslaved workers carried crates across planks while merchants shouted prices. Everywhere they went, every meeting, every drawing room, every hallway, people stared at Jean-Baptiste. Not casually, not politely, with open fascination. Women found reasons to linger near him, drifting past as though drawn by an invisible force. Men studied him with a detached assessment normally reserved for fine horses or rare antiques. Conversations halted when he entered a room, as though he disrupted the very category of slave by existing. During the third meeting, a business discussion at the elegant home of Monsieur Philippe Larocque, Madame Larocque approached Augustine during a pause in negotiations. "Monsieur Devereux," she said in fluent French, "forgive my directness, but I must ask, who is that young man who accompanies you?" "My secretary, a recent acquisition."
Acquisition? Her voice betrayed her disbelief. He is extraordinary. I have never seen a man of such appearance enslaved in this city. Her eyes narrowed slightly. Where did you acquire him? A private sale from an estate near Columbia? Augustine lied smoothly. Madame Larocque nodded thoughtfully. Would you consider offers? Before Augustine could respond, another woman, Madame Fournier, a wealthy widow with a reputation for collecting light-skinned domestic servants, joined the conversation. I would pay handsomely for him, she said, her gaze fixed on Jean-Baptiste with unsettling intensity. Augustine politely dismissed the offers, but their interest planted a seed in his mind, a number, a possibility, a calculation. That night, after the steamboat returned them to Riverbend Parish, Augustine sat in his study, running figures. He had recorded Jean-Baptiste's value at $2,000, already excessive for a domestic servant, but based on the reactions in Charleston, he suspected the young man could fetch far more. $3,000, $4,000, perhaps even higher. The thought thrilled him. And something else had begun to worry him. Jean-Baptiste was too noticeable, too memorable, too perfect. Someone would eventually ask the wrong question, make a connection, wonder why Augustine's slave looked like a European aristocrat. Better to sell him publicly, legally, prestigiously, before anyone did. The Charleston Exchange House held slave auctions daily, except Sunday. The crowds were wealthy, the records meticulous, the prices astronomical for rare offerings. Selling someone as beautiful and educated as Jean-Baptiste would create a sensation. Augustine would profit enormously, and his troublesome nephew would vanish into some wealthy household, far from Riverbend Parish.
On May 8th, he began making arrangements. Jean-Baptiste learned of this plan on May 10th. It was Sunday afternoon. He was in his cabin reading Montaigne when the door suddenly opened. Augustin entered with Gaines Rutherford and another male servant. 3 men at once was a message in itself. "I have decided to sell you," Augustin said in French, as though announcing the weather. "You will be presented at the Charleston Exchange House on May 14th. The book fell from Jean-Baptiste's hands. "You gave me your word," he whispered, "that this was temporary. You said you would help me leave South Carolina one day. And I will, by placing you in a refined household in Charleston. You will be much more comfortable there. It is an improvement." "I am not a slave to be sold," Jean-Baptiste said, his voice trembling with a mixture of fury and disbelief. "I am your brother's son." "You are forgetting your situation," Augustin said calmly. "Your mother's ancestry makes your status uncertain. Without documentation proving her free birth, which you do not have, you could be claimed by anyone. My documents, my certificates, my birth record are with me for safekeeping, and none of them prove your mother's legal status. You are vulnerable. I am protecting you." "By selling me?" Jean-Baptiste choked. "By placing you with someone who will treat you well." Jean-Baptiste stared at him. "Please, please don't do this. My father trusted you, and I am honoring his trust. Now, prepare yourself. You will cooperate, or you will be restrained." Resistance was impossible. Escape was futile. Jean-Baptiste felt something inside him collapse. Not his spirit, but the illusion of safety he had held on to. He nodded quietly. "I will cooperate." "Good," Augustin said. "We leave on the 13th. They locked the cabin door behind them. Jean-Baptiste sank onto the bed, shaking, not from fear, but from a cold, bright fury. He could not fight Augustin's power, but he could still act. He could still speak. He tore a sheet of paper from his notebook and began to write. For 3 hours he wrote, documenting everything that had happened since the moment he stepped off the boat. His arrival, the confiscation of his papers, the false entry in the plantation ledger, the decision to sell him. He wrote in impeccable, formal French. He addressed it to the French consulate in Charleston. He folded it, hid it inside Montaigne's spine beside his earlier inventory, and waited. He would not be sold, silently.
The next morning, the cabin door was unlocked. Gaines Rutherford entered, carrying a tray of food. His expression was unreadable. "You're free to move about the grounds today," he said in English, "but you're not to leave the property." Then he left without further explanation, as though the decision to sell Jean-Baptiste had already become a settled fact in his mind, something a man like him had no power to alter and no reason to question. Jean-Baptiste walked the plantation that day in a daze. The rice fields shimmered beneath the sun, flooded with still water that reflected the sky like a broken mirror. He watched men and women bent over in the paddies, their feet sinking into the mud, their backs straining under the weight of endless repetition. He had seen poverty in Paris. He had seen hardship. But this was something else entirely. A world built on silence and obedience, where every breath was monitored, every movement assigned value or danger. He kept walking, tracing the perimeter of Riverbend Parish, memorizing every detail, though he knew escape was impossible. The plantation was too isolated, the surrounding wetlands too treacherous, the overseer's dogs too well trained. Even if he ran, where would he go? He spoke English imperfectly, had no allies beyond a few sympathetic servants, and lacked money, documents, and legal protection. South Carolina was a labyrinth designed to consume men like him. Late in the afternoon, near the stables, Thomas Bellamy approached quietly. Thomas was a soft-spoken man in his 30s with a cautious way of looking around before speaking. He had been kind to Jean-Baptiste in small ways, never demanding anything in return. "I heard what's happening," he said in low French. "They're taking you to Charleston." "Yes," Jean-Baptiste replied. "To sell me." Thomas glanced around again before stepping closer. "Why are they doing this? You're different. We all know it. My existence is inconvenient. Selling me solves that inconvenience." Thomas's mouth tightened. "Is there anything I can do?" Thomas looked at him steadily. "Yes, but you must wait until the day after the auction." Thomas nodded without hesitation. "Tell me." Jean-Baptiste returned to his cabin, retrieved the letter he had written for the French consulate, and handed it to Thomas with both hands. "On May 15th, go to Charleston. Walk into the French consulate on Chalmers Street. Give this letter to anyone there. Tell them it is urgent." Thomas tucked the letter into his shirt, close to his heart. "Do you believe it will help?" Thomas asked. "I don't know," Jean-Baptiste admitted. "Perhaps not. But I cannot stand silent while someone sells my name and my life." Thomas nodded again. "I'll do it." "Why?" Jean-Baptiste asked softly. "Why help me?" Thomas's answer was simple and devastating. "Because sometimes doing the right thing is all a man has, even when it changes nothing." 2 days later, on May 13th, they left Riverbend Parish. Augustine, Gaines, and Jean-Baptiste boarded a steamboat bound for Charleston. The journey was quiet. Augustine spent most of the trip reviewing business papers. Gaines sat near the bow, eyes scanning the riverbanks with habitual vigilance. Jean-Baptiste stared at the murky water slipping past, wondering if some part of him would be left behind in its current. They arrived in Charleston near dusk. The city glowed under oil lamps, streets alive with clattering carriages and laughter spilling out of taverns. But Jean-Baptiste was not taken to a guest room. Instead, he was led through a side entrance of the Charleston Exchange House to a secured ground-level room where valuable property was kept before auction. The room had a cot, a wash basin, and a barred window. It was cleaner than the plantation cabin, but unmistakably a holding cell. He did not sleep. He sat on the cot the entire night, knees drawn to his chest, listening to distant voices echo through the marble halls. He thought of his mother, Celeste Monroe, who had died of cholera 4 years earlier. He remembered her hands smoothing his hair, her laughter when he recited his first French poem, her eyes filled with both tenderness and a sadness he had never understood until now. He thought of his father, Christopher, exiled, sick, dying alone in New York, a man who had chosen love over family and who had paid the price every day since. And now his father's plea had delivered Jean-Baptiste into the hands of the man who had cast them both away. Near dawn, as gray light seeped through the barred window, a strange calm settled over him. He made a choice, not a plan. He had no illusions of escape, but a choice about how he would face what was coming. If he was going to be sold, he would not let it happen quietly. The morning of May 14th, 1852 dawned hot and bright. By 9 o'clock, the rotunda of the Charleston Exchange House was already filled with buyers, spectators, and curious onlookers. The building was a masterpiece of grandeur, a massive dome supported by marble columns, its floor polished to a reflective sheen. Overhead, beams of sunlight fell through a circular skylight like a spotlight on the stage below. The marble auction block dominated the center. Thousands had been sold there over the years. Men, women, children, voices silenced, names erased, identities rewritten. At 10 o'clock, Augustine Devereaux entered with Gaines Rutherford and Jean-Baptiste. Augustine had dressed him carefully in a crisp white linen shirt, charcoal trousers, and polished boots. His hair had been trimmed. His face was clean-shaven. He looked less like a slave than ever, and that, Augustine believed, would raise the price. The moment they entered, Every conversation stopped. Heads turned. A ripple of astonishment moved through the room like wind across a still pond. Jean-Baptiste walked with measured grace, each step deliberate. He carried himself with a dignity that defied the purpose of the event. Even the auctioneer, Mr. Perrault, an experienced man who prided himself on composure, paused mid-preparation when he saw the young man. For a fleeting second, the professional mask slipped. Augustine saw the reaction and felt a surge of satisfaction. The money would be extraordinary. At 10:30, Perrault stepped to the podium. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, first in English, then in French, "today we present an offering of unique distinction." Gaines led Jean-Baptiste to the platform. He stepped onto the marble slab and stood perfectly still. His amber eyes reflected the sun pouring down through the skylight, making them glow like molten gold. Perrault continued. "Age, 23, multilingual, literate in 4 languages, skilled in correspondence, bookkeeping, domestic service, of refined temperament. Let the bidding begin at $2,000. A man in the front row immediately raised his hand. $2,200. Another voice cut in sharply. $2,500. $3,000. Within seconds, the room transformed. Excitement surged. The bidding flew like gunfire. $3,500. $4,000. $4,500. $5,000. People leaned forward in their seats. Some stood. Whispers filled the air. No one had ever seen a man like this sold in Charleston. Not in beauty, not in education, not in bearing. Madame Fournier's voice cut through the din. $7,000. Monsieur Larocque snapped back. $8,000. $8,000 for a single man, a price that defied logic. And still the numbers climbed. $8,500. $9,000. The bidding was no longer business. It was obsession. At $11,000, a gasp swept the rotunda. And that was when Jean-Baptiste opened his mouth. 3 quiet words, spoken in French, but perfectly audible in the stunned silence. Je suis libre. I am free. And the world stopped. The effect of those 3 words was instant and explosive. A sound rippled through the marble rotunda, not a scream, not even a shout, but a collective gasp, sharp and disbelieving, as though the entire room had inhaled at once and forgotten to exhale. For a heartbeat, the Charleston Exchange House fell silent, as if frozen in time under the dome's unforgiving light. Even the auctioneer, Perrault, paused with his gavel half raised, his jaw slightly open. Augustin Devereux went rigid, color draining from his face before returning in a blotchy, furious red. Gaines Rutherford stepped toward the platform instinctively, but Perrault lifted a warning hand. Even he couldn't ignore what had just been said on the block. Jean-Baptiste lifted his chin, amber eyes fixed on some far-off point beyond the skylight. When he spoke again, his voice was stronger, resonant, and carried perfectly across the rotunda in both French and English. My name is Jean-Baptiste Devereux. I am the son of Christopher Devereux and Celeste Monroe. I was born free in Paris on March 12, 1829. I hold French citizenship. I arrived in South Carolina at my uncle's invitation. He confiscated my papers and recorded me fraudulently as his property. Under both French and American law, I am a free man. Chaos erupted. People surged to their feet, some shouted that he was lying, others demanded proof. A few, shaken by the confidence in his voice and the refinement of his bearing, whispered that he might be telling the truth. Madame Larocque clutched her fan to her chest, staring at him as though witnessing an apparition. Madame Fournier looked stricken, not out of sympathy, but because $11,000 had suddenly slipped through her fingers. Perrault pounded his gavel, sweat forming along his brow. Silence! The offering is not permitted to speak. You will remain silent, boy, or I am not a boy, Jean-Baptiste said, his voice cutting clean through the noise like a blade. I am a free man. The outrage grew. Some men demanded the auction stop immediately. Others insisted it continue, arguing a slave's word held no legal weight. But before anyone could move toward him, before Augustin could push forward with his prepared lie, a tall, thin man in a dark coat stepped through the crowd and onto the platform. His voice, marked with a crisp Parisian accent, sliced through the confusion. "My name is Francis Mercier. I represent the French consulate in Charleston." The rotunda fell quiet again. Mercier reached into his coat and produced a folded document. He handed it to Perrault with a steady hand. "We received a letter this morning detailing the circumstances of Mr. Jean-Baptiste Devereaux's arrival in South Carolina. This letter was written in impeccable French, demonstrating knowledge consistent with an educated Parisian. It is accompanied by confirmation from Paris, a birth record, a baptismal record, and documentation verifying his mother, Celeste Monroe, was a free woman." A sensation moved through the room: shock, anger, fascination. Perrault unfolded the document slowly, eyes widening as he read. He blinked, glanced at Augustin, then at Jean-Baptiste, and then at the assembled crowd. His hand trembled slightly. "This sale," he said, voice cracking, "cannot proceed until this matter is legally resolved." Augustin lunged forward. "These claims are lies," he shouted. "His mother was a slave named Celeste who died on my plantation in 1848. I have witnesses. This letter is a fabrication." Mercier did not flinch. "The French consulate has already authenticated Mr. Jean-Baptiste's Parisian birth." "You forged it," Augustin spat. "You saw an opportunity to interfere with a lawful transaction." The crowd began arguing again. Some defended Augustin, saying no respectable planter would risk scandal. Others murmured that the boy looked too refined, too educated, too impossibly European to be anyone's slave. Then Mercier spoke again. "We have already forwarded the letter and its attachments to the state's attorney. City officials are on their way." Gaines instinctively stepped toward Jean-Baptiste, but two Charleston constables, who had quietly entered behind Mercier, intercepted him. They didn't shackle Jean-Baptiste. That alone told the crowd everything. The authorities weren't sure whether they were dealing with property or a citizen.
Perrault slammed the gavel down. "This auction is suspended. All bids are void. The individual will be taken into custody by city authorities until the courts determine his status." Augustin shouted, protested, threatened. Buyers demanded refunds. Spectators pressed forward to glimpse the young man who had stopped an auction with 3 words. Jean-Baptiste stepped down from the platform, his face composed, his spine straight. As he walked past Augustin, their eyes met. Uncle and nephew, locked in a moment saturated with betrayal, rage, and something darker. Fear. Not Jean-Baptiste's fear, Augustin's. Then Jean-Baptiste was escorted out of the rotunda and into the bright Charleston sunlight, leaving behind a room in uproar. He was taken to the Cabildo, the building used for city government offices and holding rooms. His assigned room was neither a cell nor a guest chamber. It had a barred window, a bed, and a chair. The door locked from the outside. But he was not chained, not beaten. He was something new in Charleston, a man whose freedom or enslavement could not be easily classified. For 3 days he waited. Lawyers, clerks, and consular representatives came and went, carrying documents in and out like bees moving through a hive. They interviewed him extensively about Paris, his education, his parents, the details of his journey. He answered everything with quiet precision, never raising his voice, never wavering. Outside the Cabildo, Charleston buzzed with speculation. Newspaper editors debated whether to print the story. Merchants gossiped. Planters fumed. Some whispered that Augustin Devereaux had been caught trying to sell his own nephew. Others argued that no one could prove the mother's identity. The law was a maze, and everyone knew it. Meanwhile, crucial information surfaced. Christopher Devereaux had died in New York on May 2nd, 12 days before the auction, never knowing what his brother had done. The French consulate confirmed every document Jean-Baptiste had claimed to possess. Augustine produced 3 enslaved witnesses asserting that a slave named Celeste at Riverbend Parish had told them her son was named Jean-Baptiste. These witnesses were pressured, their testimony suspicious, their stories inconsistent. The question that consumed the lawyers was simple and impossible. Was Celeste Monroe of Paris the same as Celeste from Riverbend Parish? If yes, Jean-Baptiste was born enslaved. If no, he was a free French citizen illegally detained. On May 17th, Judge Thibodeau issued his ruling. It was a masterpiece of legal ambiguity. He declared the evidence insufficient to prove Jean-Baptiste's enslaved status. The sale was void. Augustine could not claim him as property. But because his mother's status at the time of birth could not be definitively verified, Jean-Baptiste could not be granted full legal recognition as a free man either. He existed in a limbo, neither enslaved nor fully free. He was released, but barred from leaving South Carolina without permission. When he stepped out of the Cabildo that afternoon, carrying his small trunk and clutching his French documents, the city bustled around him as though nothing extraordinary had happened. He had $8 in his pocket. He had nowhere to go. He had no family left in America. And yet he was alive, walking under the open Charleston sky, no chains on his wrists, no owner's brand on his skin. For the first time since arriving in South Carolina, he felt something like hope. A fragile, flickering thing, but hope nonetheless.
What happened after Jean-Baptiste stepped out of the Cabildo that warm afternoon in Charleston is where documented history ends and the realm of rumor, fragments, and whispered testimony begins. The city roared around him, horses clattering down Meeting Street, vendors shouting prices, the salt-heavy wind rolling off the harbor, but he heard none of it. In that moment, he felt suspended between worlds. He had no home, no nation that would claim him, no legal identity that could protect him, but he was no longer in chains, and that freedom, however precarious, was a gift he refused to squander. He walked aimlessly at first, staying near the shaded alleys and quiet corners of the French Quarter. His mind churned through possibilities, all of them limited by the same constraints. He had almost no money, his French papers carried little weight in South Carolina, and Augustine still had powerful allies who might wish to correct Judge Thibodeau's ruling. He stayed alert, avoiding any street where he might encounter someone from the Exchange House. For 3 days, he lived in the attic of a small apothecary owned by a sympathetic Frenchman, a friend of the consulate clerk. The man asked no questions. He simply handed Jean-Baptiste a key, a bucket of water, a loaf of bread, and the promise that he could stay until he found his bearings. Meanwhile, stories spread like wildfire across Charleston. In taverns, in salons, on the docks, everywhere, people whispered about the beautiful young man who had stopped an auction with 3 words and forced the courts to question their own laws. Some claimed he had already left the city. Others said he had been smuggled to a ship bound for France. A few insisted he had been murdered quietly and buried under the Exchange House itself. The truth was far simpler. He was waiting, watching, listening. On the 3rd night after his release, a knock came at the attic's small door. The apothecary whispered, "Someone here to see you." Then he disappeared down the ladder. Jean-Baptiste braced himself. The person who climbed into the attic was not a French official, not a lawyer, not anyone from the plantation. It was Thomas Bellamy. He was dressed in rough city clothes, plain, nondescript, looking nothing like the stable hand of Riverbend Parish. His eyes were tired, but steady. "You're alive," Thomas said softly. "So are you," Jean-Baptiste answered, and for the first time in days, he allowed himself a faint smile. Thomas reached into his coat and pulled out a folded letter sealed in red wax. "I took your letter to the French consulate. They read it right in front of me. I think it made the difference." "I owe you my freedom," Jean-Baptiste said. Thomas shook his head. "You owe me nothing. I did what any man should do." He hesitated, then added quietly, "Word is, Mr. Devereaux is furious. He's searching for you." A chill moved down Jean-Baptiste's spine. "To reclaim me?" Thomas shook his head again. "No, to silence you." Jean-Baptiste absorbed this without flinching. He had expected it. Augustine had already shown that he was willing to destroy documents, invent evidence, and manipulate the legal system to maintain control. Murder would not be an impossible next step. "Then I must leave South Carolina," Jean-Baptiste said, "immediately." Thomas nodded. "I heard talk at the docks. There's a merchant ship heading north tomorrow. Boston." He slid a small pouch across the floor. "Money. Not much, but enough." Jean-Baptiste looked at him with something beyond gratitude. Thomas, a man who had lived his entire life under chains, had risked everything, his safety, his life, to help someone who technically held no rank at all. "Why do this?" Jean-Baptiste asked again. Thomas gave that same sad, quiet smile. "Because you stood up there on that marble block and said your own name. You taught everyone watching that even if you lose everything, your home, your country, your family, the last thing they can take is your voice. You spoke for all of us, even if you didn't mean to." Jean-Baptiste bowed his head. "Thank you," he whispered. The next morning, just before dawn, he walked with Thomas through the fog-laced streets toward the wharves. They did not hug, did not shake hands, did not say goodbye. That kind of intimacy was dangerous in a world where men like Thomas were watched constantly. All Thomas said was, "Walk like you belong here." Jean-Baptiste nodded, and he walked. At the harbor, he boarded the merchant vessel as a laborer, no questions asked. The captain barely glanced at him. Men were always needed to haul ropes and scrub decks. He kept his head low, his French papers hidden deep inside his trunk, wrapped in cloth to protect them from seawater. The ship left Charleston on May 21st, sailing north under gray skies. After that, accounts differ. Some say he stepped off the ship in Boston and vanished before dawn, disappearing into the narrow streets of the city's French-speaking enclaves. Others claim he took another ship to Montreal, where French citizens could blend more easily into the fabric of society. One rumor suggests he boarded a vessel to Le Havre and returned to Paris under a new name, teaching music or philosophy in some quiet arrondissement far from American eyes. But there is no record of a Jean-Baptiste Devereaux in any American census after 1852. No ship manifests list a man of his name leaving Boston. No parish registers record his marriage or death. He became an absence, a shadow. An elegant ghost slipping between borders, names, and histories. But traces remained. In August of 1853, a small French-language newspaper in Cincinnati printed an advertisement for a French tutor, initials JBD, educated at the Sorbonne, accepting private pupils. No return address, no details. It appeared for 2 weeks, then vanished. In 1854, the French consulate in Charleston received a letter from someone identifying himself only as J.B. The letter thanked them for their intervention and stated he was alive, safe, and beginning anew. Then years passed, and nothing. Until 1859. That year, a package arrived at Riverbend Parish addressed to Augustine Devereaux. Inside was a French edition of The Count of Monte Cristo. On the title page, written in flowing, unmistakable script, were the words, "Frère Mal, nous sommes frères. Nous qui souffrons de la même blessure." Brother in misfortune, we are brothers. We who suffer from the same wound. Augustine recognized the handwriting instantly. He burned the book that same night. Not before his eldest daughter, Marguerite, saw it and recorded the inscription in her diary, where it survives to this day. After that, Augustine Devereaux unraveled. His reputation in Charleston society never recovered. Business partners distanced themselves. Neighbors whispered. His daughters felt the sting of social doors closing quietly in their faces. He grew paranoid. He hired investigators to search for Jean-Baptiste. They found nothing. At night, he began to speak aloud in French to no one, arguing with a presence only he could see, insisting he had acted responsibly, that he had protected his brother's son. By 1862, he was a hollow version of the man he had once been. He died during the Union occupation of Charleston, suffering from what his doctor described as melancholic exhaustion. In his final weeks, he repeated over and over, "I gave you shelter. I did what was necessary. Why can't you see that?" He died without answers. In contrast, Christopher Devereux had died peacefully. According to the nun who tended him in his last days, he seemed oddly content at the end. He whispered shortly before passing, "My son is free. That is all that matters." Whether he truly knew the truth or simply hoped for it, no one can say.
The Charleston Exchange House continued operating for another decade, conducting auctions through the late 1850s and into the early days of the Civil War. But the auction of May 14, 1852, the day a young man stood on a marble block and declared himself free, was never again mentioned in its official ledgers or promotional materials. Every trace of that afternoon vanished from the Exchange House's public records. Bills of sale, bidder agreements, suspension notices, all missing. As if the event had been carefully erased not only from the physical archives, but from institutional memory. Yet the story refused to die. It lived in whispers, passed through the hidden channels of the French Creole families of Charleston, carried across parlor conversations, and folded between the pages of private letters. It lived in the testimonies of those who had been there that day, in the shocked expressions of women whose diaries described a young man of impossible beauty, declaring himself a free Parisian, and in the quiet rumors that circulated whenever the Devereux name was mentioned. The legend grew. The beautiful slave who had broken an auction with nothing but his voice, the nephew sold by his own uncle, the man who vanished into thin air after defying the system that sought to consume him. But here is what makes the story extraordinary. Nearly everything Jean-Baptiste claimed was true. The French consulate had indeed verified his birth record. His baptismal documentation existed in Paris. The registration of his mother, Celeste Monroe, as a free woman of color was confirmed by the parish office of Saint-Sulpice. His father's letters, preserved in fragments across consular files and private collections, referenced a boy raised in Parisian apartments with books and music, not cotton or rice. Even more telling, Augustine Devereux's supposed slave Celeste, the woman he claimed was Jean-Baptiste's mother, never appeared in any Riverbend parish inventory before 1852. Not in ledgers, not in birth logs, not in death records, not even in the overseer's notes. There was no trace of her existence on the plantation before the day Augustine needed her to exist. Witnesses provided by Augustine swore they had known her, but their testimonies contradicted each other, varied in detail, and bore the unmistakable marks of coaching. They had been pressured to give June birth dates or July death dates, depending on what would best support Augustine's legal argument. The simplest explanation was the darkest. Celeste of Riverbend Parish never existed. Augustine had fabricated her entirely. He constructed a false identity for a woman who had never been there, created a false history, and pressed enslaved workers to support a false narrative just to justify selling his nephew. If that was true, then what happened at the Charleston Exchange House wasn't merely a scandal. It was the exposure of a carefully engineered fraud. Perhaps that is why the South Carolina legislature sealed the auction's records in early 1853, and why for more than a century and a half, every academic request to view them has been denied. The official excuse is always
privacy concerns for potential descendants, but anyone with sense can see that is a smokescreen. Whatever lies in those sealed files is not about descendants today, it is about accountability then, and institutions rarely volunteer to expose their own sins. Some believe the sealed documents contain testimony from high-ranking families in Charleston who were present that day, families who later provided funds to the Confederacy, whose names adorn public buildings, whose reputations would suffer if their involvement in a fraudulent sale were revealed.
Others believe the records contain the key to John Baptiste's fate: a canceled travel document, a ship manifest, a private letter intercepted and stored away. But perhaps the truth is simpler. The records remain locked because someone powerful decided long ago that the story should stay buried. Even buried stories have roots, however, and roots have a way of breaking through stone. In 1897, 45 years after the auction, an elderly Creole woman named Madame Henriette Blanchard was interviewed by a genealogist collecting oral histories. She had been a young woman in Charleston in 1852, present that day under the dome. When asked about the infamous auction, she leaned back in her chair, eyes misted with memory. "Oh, he was free," she said simply. "Anyone could see it." The genealogist asked what she meant. "Free people stand differently," she replied. "There is something in the way they hold their heads." He stood like a man who had been taught that he mattered, even if the law disagreed. When asked if she believed he survived, if he escaped, she smiled. "I think he went somewhere cold," she said. "Somewhere his face didn't carry meaning. Canada, perhaps, or the North, or maybe back to France. Somewhere he could simply be himself, not a category on a ledger." "And you think he lived?" She nodded. "A man like that doesn't vanish. He changes form." Her words echoed what many suspected, that John Baptiste had done what his mother and father had done before him, built an identity out of the ashes of another. Reinvention wasn't just survival, it was resistance. And perhaps that is the point of the story. Because the question people ask today is always the same. Did he escape? What became of him? Where did he go? But maybe that's the wrong question. Maybe the reason we search for John Baptiste in censuses, shipping records, and forgotten graveyards is not because we need to know if he lived, but because we need to believe that someone in his position could live. That someone confronted with a system built specifically to erase him could stand in front of hundreds of people, speak his own name, claim his own truth, and walk away, damaged but undefeated. In a world built on ownership, he insisted on self-possession. In a world determined to define him, he defined himself. He made the auction pause. He made the law hesitate. He made history remember. Maybe that is his victory. And maybe that is why we still tell his story 170 years later, because it reminds us of the fragile, defiant power of a single human voice saying, "I am here. I exist. I will not be erased." So what do you think happened to John Baptiste Devereaux? Did he flee to the north, escape to France, slip into Canada under a different name? Or does some dusty archive, sealed, hidden, waiting, contain the truth that no one has yet been allowed to see? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Share this story with someone who loves dark history, hidden mysteries, and the voices they tried to bury. And if you want more stories like this, stories that demand to be heard, subscribe. Because somewhere out there, in an old sealed record or a forgotten ledger, the full truth about John Baptiste may still be waiting to be found.